Begin the current Daf Mesechtes Bava Kama Daf Samach Aleph. Begin 14 lines down by the top of the Yomid, where the Gemara continues the halacha, the next Mishnah, continuing this mazik that we're discussing over here, the mazik of Eish, of fire. Choose close part of Bakazik and Cheskel, turn to Daf Hachaim. Appreciate during today's Daf. Should be a schos for Achinim and Yisrael and Ezra throughout the entire world. Like we said, but Chassid Mezuk Mevinshuna Ana Yu, that we should have a Zisa Yu. So what we're discussing today's Daf are Tava Hadleka, regarding a fire passing and causing damage. The question is about what is considered negligence for the fact that the fire went and spread. And some of the ideas we discuss are over Geder, if it passes a wall, over Nar, if it passes a river. The question is Ad Kama Taver, until how much does it have to pass over to be considered that it was your negligence. Some of the other important terms and concepts are Taman, which is the machlekes we have regarding something that's hidden in something else, if you're going to be liable, and then certain cases that we'll find that even those who hold generally you're going to be pater, are cases that you're going to be chayiv, and the other way is true also. Ironically, regarding if you have a vault, if you have some type of a container, what do we presume is inside of it? And the shilo mokim, if someone has borrowed a place. So we begin the current Daf Samach Aleph, 14 lines down at the top of the Yomid, where we continue the halacha of the Mishnah with the mazik of Eish. Says the Mishnah, Aver Geder shu gavaya daled amas. If the fire passes a wall that's 4 amas high, or derech harabim, it passes through a public path which is 16 amas wide. And we learned this out in Mesechtes Shabbos of Tzadachas from the agolis, from the wagons of the encampment that they had in the midbar, which was 16 amas wide. Nohor, or passes a river. Either one of these, you're going to be pater. We don't consider you as negligent. We don't expect it to have passed such a barrier. And if it does, one is going to be exempt. Now, says the Gemara the following question. But Tanya will learn in the Braisa, Aver Geder shu gavaya arba amas chayiv. We see that if it passes over a wall that's 4 amas, you're going to be liable. Our Mishnah said you're going to be pater. How do we resolve this contradiction? Says the Gemara Marapapa, he says, no one disagrees. But Tana Didan Kachashem Milmala Lamata. Our Tana is going from the top down, meaning, like the Gemara explains, what does that mean? So, Sheish Amis, if the wall is 6 amas high, oh, sure, pot, you're going to be exempt. Chamish Amis, if it's even 5 amas high, pot, you're going to be exempt. Ad Arba Amis, all the way down till 4 amas, even if it's that low, pot, you're going to be exempt. And he holds what's called Ad Vi'ad B'chlal, which is when you say up until something, do you include that thing too? Yes. Ad until 4 amas. So our Mishnah is saying when it's 4 amas high, even that is going to be pater. But Tana Bra, the Tana from the Braisa, was counting from the bottom up, saying when you're negligent. Shtei amas, if it's only 2 amas high, it's not such a tall wall, chayiv, you're going to be liable. Sholosh amas, if it's 3 amas high, chayiv, you're going to be liable. Ad arba amas, until 4 amas high, then you're going to be chayiv, because as Rashi explains, that Daled Amis, he agrees the time of the Braisa, like our Mishnah, that you're going to be pater. When he says Daled Amis, he means to say up until Daled Amis, and he holds Ad Veloy Ad Bechlal. So everyone is essentially saying the same thing, that Daled Amis, you're going to be pater. The Tana of our Mishnah was saying Ad Bechlal, going from the top down, pater, Daled Amis, and pater. Tana the Braisa was saying, okay, you can be chayiv if you don't make a wall, and even an amma or 2 amas or 3 amas and 4 amas. Up until 4 amas, you can be chayiv, but up until, not including daled amas, the daled amas itself, you're going to be pater. So no one disagrees. Now, Amar Rava qualifies this halacha of our Mishnah, and he says daled amas she'amru de pater. This to be said if the wall is 4 amas high, that you're going to be exempt. Let's say around 8 feet, between 6 and 8 feet, the wall is high enough. That's a fila b'sadei kaitzim. That's even if it's bordering a field of thorns. So even if though the field that the fire jumps over there above the fence is a wall, is a field with thorns, filled with thorns, which it's very easy for it to become inflamed and to jump onto it. Even so, you're going to be pater if you had that type of a wall that's separating. However, Amar Papa, he qualifies this. He says, Misvas kaitzim b'lamal daled amas. It has to be that from the edge of the thorns and above, you have an area of daled amas. Obviously, it's not going to be enough. You have to have a partition of daled amas. So even though it's easier, it's more flammable, it's easy for the fire to spread, but it's not enough just to have a wall of Dalet Amis. It has to be above the top of the thorns. Now, we have a machlekes regarding how to qualify this teaching of our Mishnah. Amarav, he says, Lo Yishonim, we didn't learn that if you have a wall Dalet Amis, that you're going to be potter. It's ila b'kailachas. We are talking about a specific type of a fire that its fire is going upwards, like a regular fire. That's where we're saying, okay, if you make a wall Dalet Amis, that would have been a barrier that we don't expect it to pass, and if it does, you're going to be exempt. Of the nechfefes, which Rashi has two translations of what nechfefes means. Either means that the wind is lowering it. The wind is blowing downwards, bending it to the sides, and that causes the flame to stop and to jump. Or another interpretation is a low down fire that's caught onto, let's say, the vegetation that's on the ground. Either way, we're not talking about a flame that's just a regular flame going upwards. It's one which is traveling, let's say, the horizontal instead of vertical. Then then even if it passes through a public path that's very wide, even up until 100 amas, you're going to be liable. So again, it depends on what type of fire we're talking about. The Mishnah that says you're going to be exempt where a wall Dalet Amas high or a path 16 amas wide is only by a regular flame that's kalachas, that's going upwards. But if it's one that's nechfefes, if it's one that's hovering downwards, that's moving horizontal, then even 100 amas you're going to be liable because that wide path, it has no reason to get in the way of such a type of fire. That's one version. Shmuel Ami says differently. He says no, to the contrary. Masnitin min nechfefes. Our Mishnah is actually talking about by a fire that's leaping type of a fire. Aval b'kelachas, but if it's actually just a steady fire going upwards, I feel a kosher, but that even if a minute amount would already be enough for a barrier, we don't expect it to go flying anywhere. You don't have to have these larger measurements that our Mishnah spoke about of a 16 amma wide path or a 4 amma high wall. No, even a tiny little thing, it's a little grill that you have. You don't expect it to go further. So that's a machlekes regarding Rav and Shmuel. How do you qualify this teaching of our Mishnah? Which I talk about the same variables. Question is, which one is our Mishnah talking about? Now it says the Gemara Tanika say the Rav. We have a brayse that says like Rav. Because the brayse says, when we say this halacha that if it passed a public path of 16 amas, then you're going to be potter is b'kailachas, by a regular flame that's going upwards. Of b'nechfefes, but if it's this hovering, leaping fire, the eitzim mitzuyin and this wood that's found for it to catch onto, I feel like 100 mil, then even 100 up until 100 mil, which is very, very, very far away, is even that you would be chayiv. So that's obviously like Rav. Now, Avra Nahar Oishlulis, if it passed, once we're bringing the brisa, we say the whole brisa, if it passed a river or a shlulis, which we're going to explain shortly what is shlulis, Shehem Ruchav Mechas Amas, as long as it's 8 amas wide, but you're going to be exempt. Again, we don't expect the fire to jump across a river that's that wide. Now, in the Mishnah, we said, after we spoke about this case of the wall Dalet Amas high, we spoke about a derech harabim. If it passes a public path, you're also going to be potter. Says Gemara Mantana, who's the town of a Mishnah? Rabbi says Rabbi Lezer, the town which we learned him actually on Amid Beis on the second side. Rabbi Lezer says Sheish Esri Amos Kederech Rabim. If it passes a path that's 6 numbers wide like a public path, potter can be exempt. So what's the point of this? Says Taisus that this is what's called a stam achkach machlekes, because Rabbi Lezer's opinion is going to be disputed with 2 other Tanoim and Amid Beis, and here it's saying it anonymously. So that teaches us, although we usually pass like a stam masnitin, like an anonymous Mishnah, when it's subsequently taught as a dispute, as a machlekes, we don't necessarily do that. So the Gemara is clarifying that this is like a das yachad of like Rabbi Eliezer, but it's actually disputed on the next Mishnah. Now the Mishnah then continued and said, Oy nohar, or it passed through a river. That's also something we wouldn't expect the fire to pass by, and therefore it's not your negligence, and therefore you're not going to be chayiv. So on that says the Gemara, 2 opinions. Rav Amai says Nahar Mamash, we're talking about literally a river. And Shmuel Amai says no, Arisa Didaloi, which is a small little irrigation ditch, which they draw the water from and they water the fields. That's what we're talking about as also a sufficient barrier from the fire. So the Gemara explains, Man Nahar Mamash, according to the one that says that we're literally talking about a river, is Avagav Lekamaya. Even if there's no water inside this river, but since it's wide, so it's like a public path, again, that we don't expect the fire to pass through. But Amanda Marisa did loy, but according to the one that says we're talking about an irrigation ditch, Only if it has water, yes. But if there's no water, that would not be a sufficient barrier. The fire could quickly pass across, and therefore one would be chayiv for that eish. Now the Gemara says Snan Hasam. We learn over there in the Mishnah Masechta Peya that brings in a variable that we had mentioned before, which it talks about over there. Ve'elu mafsikin lepeya. Now, Allah is, as we know, when you have a field, you have to leave over a corner of the field for the poor people. Now, the question is, how do you qualify a field? Let's say you have many areas. So on that says the Mishnah that there are certain things that interrupt for the halacha peya that makes it into a separate field. That now this would be qualified as its own area, and you would have to separate another corner from this area itself. What are the things that separate for the halachas of peya? Hanachal, the ravine. If you have a field on either side of this river, and you have a deep ravine in the middle, you would have to leave a corner of every one of those fields, and v'hashlulis, which we'll translate again in a second, v'derech hayachid, and a individual path of 4 amas, and v'derech harabim, and a public path. Says the Gemara, my shlulis. What is shlulis? Which separates the areas into separate fields. So Rabbi Yehuda Mishmoli says, Makom shemei gesham shoylin sham. So the word shlulis is a place where the rainwater gathers over there. Like Rashi brings different examples of that. You see that the word shol means to gather. So it means the area where the rain gathers. Bibi Rabbi Yechanan, he says it's amas hamayim. It's a stream of water. Why is that called shalulis? Shemechalekes shalol lagapeha, where it separates, it divides its bounty to its banks, where it waters from the stream that flows through it, which makes peiros, which because the fruits, which is the shalol, and therefore, when it overflows, like Taisa says, it fills up all the area that's around it. That's why it's called shalol. So 2 different interpretations. What's a shlulis? Either it's talking about these pits where the rainwater gathers, or it's like a stream, and therefore there would be different interpretations of the word shalol, which would make it shlulis. But says the Gemara explains that according to one that says it's the area where the rainwater gathers over there, that it's enough to be a separation to make it into a separate field, to have to leave another corner for the poor. If he holds that it's just enough with this pit with where the rainwater gathers, for sure a stream of water would separate. Now, the one who holds that has to be a canal of a makom shemei gesham shoylin, but you're right, if it was only where the rainwater gathers, lo mifsiki, that would not separate into a new field. The reason for that is because the hanu, as we continue to Tamid Beis, those are just ba'agni da'ara mikru. They're called the bowls of the land. Meaning it's not considered like a separate area. It's like it's where you have crevices and clefts and all these different things. That's where the rainwater is gathering. That's not like a canal, which is its own distinct and independent entity. And therefore, he holds that wouldn't. And again, the reason why we brought this in, even though there's halacha peya, was because we mentioned that from the previous brisa, that if it passes a shlulis, which is 8 amas wide, you're going to be potter. There's the 2 different interpretations. What's a shlulis? Either it's a place where the rainwater gathers, or it's a canal of water. The halacha of the next Mishnah of the mazik of Eish. Hamadlik b'tech shalai. So a guy lights a fire in his own property. He has the oilam over, and he's making this little, in this fire pit, he's making a fire. Ad kama tavar ad leka. Until how much would we say that if the fire passes, that it's considered as a negligence? So we have 3 different opinions in our Mishnah. But he says that Royan Oisa Kilu Be'emtza base core. Review his fire as if it's the middle of a base core. In other words, if he has an area of a half of a base core in every direction, which is 137 amas, does he mean potter? Because you have enough of a buffer zone that we wouldn't have expected that it would travel to someone else's property. Which Rashi explains that we're talking about the fire of kailachas, which is a regular fire that goes up, which jumped, as we explained in the previous Mishnah, because of its nechfefes. If it's this hovering, this horizontal fire, that continues to burn, then even up until 100 mil, it could go miles and miles, and you'd still be chayiv. So we're talking about the regular fire, making your fire pit, that is, we view it as if it's the middle of a base core, then you'd be potter. Rabbi Lazami says, Tezai Namas. And this is who we mentioned on Amid Aleph, that we said that he was the Tana of our Mishnah, which is Der Charabim is Mafsik. If you have 16 Amas, then you're going to be Pater. but we said he's only one of three opinions, kederech reshus haram, like the public path. The third opinion is Rabbi Kiva Omer. He says 50 amma, 50 ammas. And the fourth opinion, Shimon Omer, which we'll see in the Gemara exactly what is he saying. The Torah tells us, Shalom Yishalom Hama Be'era, the one who makes the fire shall surely pay. So it says Have'era, which is Hakol Lefi Hadleka. They tell us everything goes according to the flame, which the Gemara originally assumes that you always have to pay. As much as you lit a fire, whether it was close or far, it sounds like everything is according to the flame. So on that, as the Gemara, what does Rabbi Shimon not have any measurements when it comes to the halacha of a fire? Like the first place here says that the Gemara is assuming that everything according to the damage of the fire that you made, you have to pay, even if it's not fit to pass. But says the Gemara, but it's not. But we learn the Mishnah Bava Basra that says the following halacha: Lo yamer adam taner b'teich habayis. A person should not place an oven, a furnace, into his house. And Rashi says the people of the city could stop him, because once this house catches on fire, the fire passes and the whole city's in danger. Tesa brings differently. That's regarding the people who live on the second floor and the first floor, about, obviously being concerned, we live in the same house, about causing a fire. But be that as it may, a person is not allowed to put an oven in his house, unless there's a height above the oven, a height of dalet amos, so you have like a 6 to 8 feet above the oven between it and the ceiling. Let's say he was on the second floor and he was putting it on the second floor. Has to have that at least beneath the oven. You have a layer of plaster that's on the roof of the first floor that obviously doesn't catch on to the floor, as long as you have this plaster of shleisha tfachim, of 3 handbreadths. And the bekira, which is a different type of a stove, which is lesser heat than an oven, and you don't burn up such hot flames inside of it. So then tafach, you only have to have a layer of a handbreadth of a plaster. Now, what happens if you did these precautions and you made sure it had all the requisite measurements for the standards that are necessary, and in spite of having hizik and the damages, okay, mashal hizik, says the Tanna Kamma, okay, you obviously have to pay for the damage that you caused with your fire. Shimon Ami says no. The whole point of these measurements were said, Elishem hizik patim l'sham. Only if it damages, you can be exempt from paying. That was the point. I think you did what you were necessary to do. You took the proper precautions, and now if something happens, it's not your liability. Fine, that's their machlekes. But that's not the main thing we want. The main thing we want is that Rabbi Shimon says that there's measurements that are necessary to put into place of 4 amas above your oven and 3 tvachim beneath it when you're on the second story. I thought there's no shiurim. I thought no matter what happens, you can be liable. And here Rabbi Shimon saying that no, you can be parted from paying if you did certain measurements. You see that there are limitations. So Rav Nachman, Rav Bavu, he says you're right. Hakol lefi goyva hadleka, meaning it's like he said in our Mishnah that hakol lefi hadleka, but the words are hakol lefi goyva hadleka, meaning how large and big the flame is, it's going to jump further, and that's what he's saying, that therefore you have to take these precautions. No matter how high your flame is, you have to have a certain distance from the top of the oven. So therefore that doesn't contradict the concept that we're saying, that it depends. When you say hakol lefi hadleka, it doesn't mean you're always going to be chayav. It depends on how high the flame is, and did you take proper precautions that it shouldn't go ahead and damage. I'm Rabbi Yisrael and Rabbi Yehuda Mishmul says halacha Rabbi Shimon, that hakol lefi goyva hadleka, you can't just give an area of liability like the other 3 opinions. It's all subjective. It's all going to depend on the circumstances of what type of fire he made. Now look at the next Mishnah. Continue on this mazik of Eish. Hamadlik es hagadish. Here it gets a little bit more complex. If someone burns someone's stack of grain, and inside it was discovered that they were vessels, vidalku, and they were burnt in the fire of the grain. So we have machlekes, which this is known as taman, which we've mentioned in the past. Rabbi Yehuda says, Mishal masha b'teichai. You have to pay what's inside. You are liable for these hidden objects, even though they're taman. You're just like you're chayav for whatever fire burns, so too you're going to be liable for the vessels that were inside. The sages say, no, you're only going to have to pay for a pile of wheat or a pile of barley, meaning if it was wheat, then you pay wheat. If it's a pile of barley, barley, but you won't have to pay for the hidden items that were inside. Continues the Mishnah, and we've quoted this in the past regarding this case of if there's a goat that is tied to the pile of grain, and there was a slave that was nearby, and he gets burnt with the pile of grain. Chayiv, you can be liable, says Rashi, on what? On the kid goat. Why? Because living creatures were included from Bava Kama, which it says in the Torah when the fire is going to go out, it's going to eat the pile of grain, Bava Kama, or the standing grain. We said Kama could be read like Kaima. Any Bali Kaima, any things of stature, of height, including an animal, you're chayav for the Eish. Now, because of Kamle B'dirabe B'minei, which is that when you're liable for something more severe, you're not liable for something less severe, that does not apply over here, even though you killed the slave with the fire. Why? Because you're not liable for the death of the slave. Why not? Because since the slave was not tied, the goat was tied, but the slave was nearby, so he should have ran away. So you're exempt from his death and from any monetary payment. So therefore, you'll be chayiv for the liability of not only the grain, but also the gedi, the goat that was tied to it. But let's say it was the other way around. Let's say it was eved kafas. Let's say the slave was tied to the grain, and the goat was nearby, and then in this way they get burned with the grain. Potter, you're going to be exempt even on the goat and even on the grain. Why? Because you're liable for death for the slave. Because the Torah tells us, nakim inakim, that if someone kills a slave, he's going to be liable for his death. Now, that kicks in the principle of kamle b'dirab, which is that we only give you the more severe of the two punishments. Now, says Rashi, even if he wasn't warned beforehand, where then the guy who made the fire is not going to get executed. Gemara Ksubas of Lamadal tells us that when you do by mistake something that would usually give you capital punishment, so when you do by mistake, you don't get killed, you will be potter, however, for having killed that person. Now, Rashi tells us two interpretations regarding the goat. The way we described this case was, we said that the slave was tied and the goat was nearby. So first Rashi tells us that truth is regarding the goat, it doesn't make a difference if it was tied or not tied. It's just since by the case of the Eved, it was relevant if he was tied or not, because when he's not tied, you're not liable, he should have ran away. When he is tied, you are going to be liable because he couldn't run away. So therefore we say the same thing by Gedi, we say whether he's kafos or not. That's one version. Some want to say, which was the Pirush of the Rashbam that's brought in Taisus and the Chavbeis and Beis, that actually by Gedi it is precise also. That when we say that the Gedi is this last case, that he's only samuch, he's only close and not tied, so he said you're going to be pater, so that's because the goat should have ran away. So that's what the actually this case of the Seifa is actually two different cases. Either the slave is tied, and then you can be pater on the goat because of Kamud Rabbineh, or it's another case, or the goat is nearby, and then you can be pater. So it's the case of Seifa could be split into two cases according to the second interpretation. It's not like, oh, the slave was tied and the goat was nearby, then you can be pater. No, it's either one. If the slave was tied, you'll be pater on the Gedi, or if the goat was nearby, you're also pater because the goat should have ran away, just like we say by the slave. Now, Rashi says, although the Gemara told us at the end of the second parak that sheire kimamoinoi, which means to say that if you put your coal on that and it gets burned, you're going to be chayiv. Says Rashi, that's where he puts it on the shur, where the ox could not have the ability to take off the coal. But here it should have ran away, and the fact that it didn't is not considered the liability of the one who started the fire. So again, that's two different interpretations in Rashi regarding this case of Gedi Samachlai. Be that as it may, obviously if the evidence kafas lay, you're going to be pater because of kimle b'dramne, because you're liable for the death of the slave. Now, continues the Mishnah. Although we had in the ratio of the Mishnah Machlekes Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim regarding Tamun, regarding if something is hidden inside the pile of grain, but a Moed Mechacham Rabbi Yehuda, the Chacham agreed Rabbi Yehuda that you will be chayiv for something that's hidden in the following case. B'madlik es habira. regarding when you light a building on fire, you commit an act of arson. That you have to pay whatever's inside of it. Why? Because it's normal for people to put objects in their house. We know people have beds and dressers and whatever. So therefore, there, unlike the case of just you have a watch that was inside a pile of grain that you're going to be pater according to Chachamim, if a house he burns up, he's going to be chayav whatever's inside of it. Now, the Gemara makes an important qualification and distinction regarding the halacha of Mishnah. Amrav Kana. He says, the machlekes in our Mishnah, if you're going to be chayiv in a hidden object or not, is b'matlik b'teich shalai. If you lit the fire in your own property, you're making a fire pit, you had this kumzitz on Thursday night, things got out of control, the fire went and consumed the friend's property next door. That's the machlekes. You read the Mechav and this Kitam Beish. He says, okay, look, you're liable for your fire's damages and even something that was hidden inside. Rabban say you're going to be pater. Fine. But if, let's say, you go and light the fire in your friend's property, which he has no permission, and therefore is like actively destroying something, everyone agrees that you would have to pay whatever is inside that is hidden. Which, as Taisa explains, the bottom Taisus on the Maskal Ella, on the second to the bottom line, he says that the Rabbanan that say you're pater when you light a fire in your own property, that's because the pasuk makes it sound like kiseitze eish. That meaning this halacha that we know they learn out that Taman is pater is in the biblical narrative when the fire goes out. What do you mean it goes out? Meaning you lit it in your own property and it goes out to someone else's property. But when you light on someone else's property, there we don't have the biblical exemption of Taman. There you would be liable even if something is hidden. On that, Amalei Rava says to Rav Kahana, he says, wait a second. If that's the case, I have the following question for you. Adatani safe instead of the safe of the Mishnah telling us. Remember, we had this machlekes of Taman. Chacham said you're not liable for Taman. The Sefer says, I'll tell you a case when the Chacham agree that you would be liable for Taman. They agree b'madlik esabida. When you light a building which is in his friend's property. Even so, the Mishnah had to tell us the reason shemisham kol ma shebeteich, you'll pay whatever's inside the building. Says the Mishnah, you know why the Chacham agree? Shekin derech b'nei adam laniach bebatim. Because it's normal for people to put stuff inside homes. We know there's stuff inside, but a pile of grain is not normal to have stuff inside. Now, the problem with this is, according to Rav Kahana, liflig v'lisni b'dida, which is a classic Talmudic question. If you're talking about one case, you'd rather make a differentiation and a division in that case itself. So why are we going to another case instead of talking about a pile of grain? We start talking about, Chacham will agree in the case of a building. Why don't you differentiate in the grain itself and say, wait, when we say that according to the Chachamim, that you're going to be pater on the hidden object is b'malik b'teich shalai. If you lit the fire in your own property, and then it goes and consumes in your friend's property. But if you lit the fire in your friend's property, even though it's not normal to have those objects hidden over there, that everyone agrees that you'd have to pay for whatever's inside of it because you lit it in your friend's property. And for sure, the guy's building. Because the building is normal to have objects inside of that. That was what the Mishnah said. I mean, the Mishnah makes it sound like that's the svara because of it's normal. It definitely is more normal than, let's say, a pile of grain. So if you're telling me so in other words, why do you have to go on to another case of the building? Say in the case of the grain itself, you told me that the halach is only when he lit in his own property. But when he lights in his friend's property, he's going to be chayiv for kamash b'teicha. So why move on to another case? So Elamar Rava says that betarti pligi. It's actually two different areas that they disagree in our Mishnah as follows. Pligi b'madlik b'teich shalai. So they disagree regarding when the guy lights a fire in his own property. And then it goes and it consumes it in his friend's property. That's like Rav Kahana said. That's the halach of our Mishnah. The review the Mechav Tam Beish really says you're going to be liable for something that's hidden for the mazik of fire. The Rabban Sarbi and they hold loy mechayev. No, you're not going to be liable. And the Rabbanan exempt a person, even vessels that are normal to conceal in the pile of grain. because that's a gezeres hakasef. It's a biblical decree. That's something that's hidden by the mazik of fire. You're going to be potter. So that's not because of normal or not normal. That doesn't make a difference. Whereas if Yehuda says you're liable for something that's hidden, and by vessels, it doesn't make a difference if it's normal or not normal. He holds that you can be chayav tambesh, as we already brought this in the previous stuff. The way the machlekes is how you learn that from the psukim, like we said, of Bava Kama, what's learned out from the different words of the Torah. Fine. But then there's another machlekes. There's a machlekes also when you light the fire in your friend's property. What's the machlekes? So now the Rav Kama that said everyone agrees when it's lit in the friend's property, you're going to be chayav. There's another machlekes over there too. The Yehuda holds he holds you're going to have to pay for whatever is in your friend's property, even an arniki, meaning even if you have like a treasure box inside the pile of grain, which is not normal to be put into a pile of grain, doesn't make a difference. You're chayav for taman, and now that it's in the friend's property, yeah, for sure you're going to be chayav. Rabban Sabi, the Rabban hold that no. Remember, the Rabban are the ones who hold you're not usually chayav on taman. There's a new thing we're hearing about that when you light in the friend's property, which you have no permission, that then you be chayav even something that taman like Taisa explained, because that's not including the biblical exemption of taman, because the biblical case was talking about kisei seish when it started in your property and left. Okay, you're going to be chayav when you go and light up someone else's in his property, but for what? That has to make sense of what you're actively negligent for. That's only kelim shedarchan lahat and begadish. It's only tools or vessels that are normal to be hiding inside a pile of grain. What's normal to be hiding in a pile of grain? So we all know when we rake our leaves, we end up finding the rake inside the leaves. We know when we drive over in the snowstorm and we end up breaking our shovel because the kids left it there inside the pile of snow. So there are certain things that are normal to be inside the pile of grain. Kagon merigin, which are these beams that have holes and they have pegs inside of it, and they use to thresh the grain. So that's a tool, ukli bakar, or the tools of the cattle. That's normal to be inside the pile of grain. Hu de mishalim. That's what something that's normal to be hidden there, where we don't find that the pasuk exempts you on taman in the case of when it was lit the fire in someone else's property. It's something that's normal that you'll have to pay. But tools which are not normal to be hidden inside the pile of grain, that loy mishalim, that you don't have to pay. And therefore, like Taisa says, the last line of Taisa says, something that's not normal, that they exempt you from svara, because you didn't have to entertain to think that a person will put his treasure chest inside the pile of grain. So though, yeah, it's your negligence, but it's not going to be to the extent of being chayiv for even things that are not normal. Now, the Gemara continues a related discussion. Turn about learn the brayso. Amadlik is hagadish. So someone burns up a pile of grain. And there were vessels over there, and they lit up on fire, and they got burnt. So Yehuda says, okay, he holds taman, something that's concealed. You have to pay whatever's inside of it. They say no. You'll only have to pay for the pile of grain. Shalchitin, if it's wheat, or gadish al or the pile of grain, if it's barley, pay barley. Now, what's interesting is that Chum say, you see the area of where the vessels are as if it's filled with grain. So although you don't have to pay for taman, but you do have to pay as if that was grain. So like people say, take out the ice. You know what I'm saying? There's only that much room in the cup. You know what I'm saying? So you don't want the ice, to take up space, when you're getting that cold soft drink, whatever. So there's a certain amount of space. You knew there was this amount of grain. Now, you didn't know there was vessels over there in your potter and taman. But interestingly, that area, they say that you have to view it as if it's full of grain. It'll be chayiv on that. What? Yeah, you have to understand even what is the liability. Why are you being chayiv on the area that as if it was malay tvu? Because I'm saying we're talking about a biblical decree that exempts you from taman. So why you chayiv? You didn't burn grain that was in that space. So why would you view it as if it's malay tvua and be chayiv on that? Right. So that's what you're asking. That's what he's asking. If that's a svara, he's asking, well, what would you say if, let's say, that it's worth? Well, it depends which one's less. Meaning if right, so ironically you can be chayiv more because you intended to burn and you didn't even consume that. So right, if you're saying it's more expensive, we're saying okay. So according to your amount of negligence, right. But if it's worth less, then you're going to be chayiv for something that you didn't even burn. Yeah, it's a chiddush. It would seem if that's what the halacha is, as it sounds like. Now, as you get in top of next amid, but when did we say this that you're going to be potter for the mazik of Eish because it's hidden? Taman is like we said, if you lit the fire in your own property, and it went and it burnt in the friend's property. But let's say he lit in his friend's property. Oh, and there's different girsais if you have the girsa divrei hakol here or not. But misham kol mashay b'toichai, then you have to pay whatever's inside, which Rashi obviously did not have the word kol that you pay because he actually has the girsa divrei hakol. That everyone holds mishal mashay b'toichai, which the difficulty is, but it's not true. Not everyone holds that you pay whatever's inside of it. That's why he does not have the girsa kol, because he says Rabbah explains according to his interpretation that is specifically because he says tartib pligi. He says that even the chacham hold, even when you light in someone else's property, you're not chayav for everything. You're chayav only for kalim that is normal to hide inside the gadish, but you wouldn't be chayav if he put his treasure chest inside his pile of grain. So therefore, Rashi obviously is not being goyrus the word kol, and therefore it would be divrei kol. But then even Rabbah could agree, so it'd probably be inversely related. Now, up until this point, we had said with a chacham agreed to Rabbi Huda. Now says the Braisa, Rabbi Huda, who holds that you're chayiv on tamen, he's moidel lechacham. He agrees to the chacham in the following case, very interesting case. The mashal makom lechaverit. What happens if someone lends a space in his property to his friend lahagdish gadish to make a pile of grain? The higdish. Now he made a pile of grain. Vehitmin, and he also hid something inside of it. That now, if let's say the property owner makes a bonfire and it burns this guy's pile of grain, she'ein mishal meldmei gadish b'vad. He'll only have to pay for the value of the pile of grain if the owner of the field caused it to burn up, because he didn't accept upon himself but the watching of a pile of grain. He didn't know that you're going to put inside your watch. You're going on a big hiking trip, and you decided to put your phone and your watch inside the pile of grain. Says, hey, I'll leave my pile of grain over here. Yeah, sure, I can leave it. I'll watch it. I didn't know you had a watch inside and your phone was inside. So therefore, even though Yehuda was the one who holds Yechayv on Tamen, he would agree that you're going to be potter for the item that's hidden inside. So too, if let's say lahagdish chitim, what happens if he said he wants to make a pile of wheat, higdish iron, and instead he left a pile of grain? Or let's say he said, I want to be able to leave in your property a pile of grain, of barley. Higdish chitin, he left wheat. Or let's say chitin, v'chipim b'sa'ayrim. Let's say he asked for permission to leave a pile of wheat, but what he did was he covered it with barley. So although he gave him permission to leave a pile of wheat, he's only going to have to pay for the value of barley. Why? Because the owner's going to tell him, he says, look, I only saw barley, so I wasn't so careful, because barley is cheaper than wheat. He didn't know that underneath that bag of barley that he had was this whole pile of wheat that was there. But since he covered it with barley, that again does not go into the negligence of the owner of the field. Or let's say Sa'irin, let's say he asked for permission to put barley, and he covered it with wheat. In both of these cases, he'll only have to pay for the value of barley, which Tosfos points out in the Maskel She'enoi, that it's talking about where he lit the fire in his own property. Because if he lit it in someone else's property, if you have barley that was covered with wheat, why wouldn't you pay for wheat since he saw it? And the Gemara shortly is going to get us more into this complex case of comparable cases, which Tosfos wants to prove that it must be talking about where it was in the guy's own property. But be that as it may, the guy only took permission. Either he took permission for wheat, but since he covered it with barley, he didn't know, so he's only going to have barley. Or he took only permission for barley, so although he covered it with wheat, yeah, but I only took permission for barley. So either way, it's only according to the limitation of that of barley. Okay, thank you to Andy for hosting us. It's a little bit more. Keep on going.